So I want to start with something only because I'm afraid that I'll talk too long and won't get to tell you this, but it fits this anyway, so I'm going to tell a little story just to start, which is this fabulous patient that I had for many years. She had been in and out of hospitals forever and was in New York at a hospital for 2 years, and they sent her to me on an ambulance plane, of all things. And she came, and I said, okay, I'd see her as long as she was in a halfway house in Seattle, and because she was very suicidal and many other things, and running down streets in nightgowns with knives and being found behind dumpsters and alleys almost dead. So I treated her for quite some time, and finally we got her through college, which was a big thing. This was more than my usual research one-year treatment, but we got her through. She actually got through college, and she moved and got a job in Los Angeles, as a teacher, and would call me because she wanted to be able to teach some of the skills to her students. I love her so much. And so I was down not too long ago. She calls me every once in a while, and we talk. And so I'd gone down, we were having lunch. And she was telling me about how awful her life was because she also was not only borderline personality disorder, but also schizoaffective. And so she was saying how hard it was to be psychotic and teach, and that it was problematic, and so that she had to take a leave, but she was tutoring now. I was so sad that I was in tears because it was just so sad that this had happened to her. And she said to me, she said, Marcia, don't be so upset. This is a lot better than being borderline was. And I think that says a lot. That being psychotic, schizoaffective beats out borderline personality disorder. So I'm going to talk a little bit about, people have talked about my treatment, dialectical behavior therapy, just to give you, someone said to me, Marcia, your job is to give us hope, so I'm going to give you hope because I'm not alone anymore. I was for years the only person doing treatment research on borderline personality disorder, and most of my life the only person doing it on suicidal behavior. But now we've managed to get other people out there doing data. There's mentalization treatment. All these young people are doing things, so there's a lot of hope. And I know this the best, so I'm going to talk about it. Dialectical behavior therapy, where it started. And tell you what I ran into. I hope it's an apple. Okay, good. So I was always wanted to work with suicide, and so I decided that I was going to work with suicide at NIMH. In those days, helped young investigators enormously. They talk to you, come run by your research with them, and I really feel, to be honest with you, NIMH is like the co-author of most of what I've done. They've been so helpful all the time. So I wanted to deal with high risk for suicide with multiple suicide attempts and self-injury, and I called all the hospitals in Seattle, and I said, I want the very worst that you've got, because I wanted to be sure that if my people got better, I would be able to tell the difference between them and the control condition. And so I got a little grant to do treatment development for suicidal behavior, and I just learned behavior therapy, and I was totally sure it would cure everybody. I had not the slightest doubt. But I ran into a bunch of problems. My first problem was the people I was treating had this extreme sensitivity to rejection and invalidation. And that made a change-focused treatment, which definitely behavior therapy in 1980 was, untenable. So I switched to an acceptance-based treatment. That was a disaster too, though, because the extreme suffering made that an acceptance-based approach untenable. The patients would say, well, you're not hearing my suffering? You're not going to help me change? And I say, no, I'll help you change. I'll help you change. They say, you're saying I'm wrong? You're saying I'm bad? I say, no, I'm not saying that. So this is sort of how it went. So I came up with an approach really by accident of just working with all these people, which ultimately got called dialectical, but dialectical is walking the middle path in many ways, where it's a synthesis of change strategies. This is on the part of the therapist, the change on the part of the therapist, and acceptance strategies on the part of the therapist, where that's my job. The next problem, though, was I was dealing with people who had an extraordinarily low distress tolerance, and it made focusing on any one problem area or one part of a problem or one disorder, as you know, they have multiple disorders, or one therapy topic impossible with frequent crises overtaking any ability for sustained work on change. So we're constantly, every topic, you go through 10 topics because of avoidance and inability to tolerate. So the solution to that was to develop an approach that taught the patients, in effect, acceptance skills, which included within there distress tolerance. And there's a whole teaching that I do module called distress tolerance. It's how to tolerate both crises and not make them worse, but also how to radically accept a life that may not be the life you want. But that doesn't mean you have to be miserable your whole life. And change skills, which all came from behavior therapy. I stole every one of them. But then I had another problem, which was the ever-changing clinical presentation, together with frequent crisis, resulted in all the therapists being confused and chaotic, and therapy got very chaotic. You've got to remember this is back in the 80s when all the behavioral treatments were protocol-based treatments. You do this, the first session this, the second session this, the third session. That was all of them. There's only one treatment manual, literally one. And that was a psychodynamically oriented treatment manual, and that didn't do that. And so I modeled after that. I had patients who were meeting criteria both for loads of Axis 1 disorders, but also Axis 2, although I didn't know that they were meeting criteria for that stuff at that time, because remember, I was focusing on suicide. So my solution was to develop an approach to treatment that combined protocol-based interventions. In other words, all of our patients get skills training, which is this week. You get the skill that we're teaching this week, and next week the one we're teaching next week. And combine that with a target-based agenda, where the target-based said, we're going to organize ourselves and do this problem first, this problem second, this problem. And life-threatening behavior, of course, was first. Life-threatening at that time was suicide, but since it's DBT is now in so many prisons, you have to look at homicide also as a life-threatening behavior. So that brought those two things together. But the next problem that I had was therapists got emotionally dysregulated treating these patients. And that led to excessive fear, excessive anger, hostility. The therapists would get angry at the patients. They try to control the patient. And it's very frightening to have a person who could be dead at any moment. And that you can't keep them from being dead. And so the therapists would then try to get in control. They would reject the patient or attack the patient. This is group 1 of the therapists. And group 2 therapists were the ones who had excessive empathy, and they would fall into the pool of despair with the client and just abandon therapy altogether, and everyone would sort of cry together. So I had to solve that. And the way I solved that was by defining a treatment team as part of the treatment. I didn't really create a treatment team. I defined a treatment team as part of the therapy, because I am going to say something to you may not be aware of. I don't think many people are. To my knowledge, there's never been one single randomized clinical trial that has ever been conducted without a team as part of the therapy, where the role of the team is to keep all the therapists doing the treatment that they are studying in that clinical trial. As far as I know, there are two things that are always done: assessment of outcomes, and some group, you have either one supervisor or a team that keeps you doing the therapy. And then we wonder why, when you take a therapy to the community, it does not work. Why? Because we don't take the entire therapy to the community. We take all kinds of things, but we leave the team that keeps you doing the therapy and assessment out of what's translated. So I just said to myself, fine, I'll just redefine therapy. And I will say, if we did a team in the research, we'll call a team part of the therapy. Since I developed the therapy, you can't say you're doing the therapy if you don't have a team. And so that's essentially how that was dealt with. And the role of the team is to treat the therapist and keep the therapist in the model. Do I believe it's important all the time? Possibly not. Do I believe it's important with high risk, out of control, difficult to treat, multi-diagnostic, suicidal patients? Yes, I do. Therapists get burned out. The next problem to solve was that I wanted to get another grant to study what I was doing, but I couldn't get a grant unless I had a mental disorder. And I was doing suicide, and I didn't have a mental disorder. So I figured, okay, someone told me at a review, actually, that I was studying borderline personality disorder. My entire manual was written without the word borderline personality disorder in it even once, because I had never heard of the disorder. So then I heard of the disorder, and I had to choose borderline personality disorder or major depression. So since most of the people appear to meet criteria for borderline, I said I'd do borderline, and my advocate at the NIMH told me, I'll never forget it, because I said, okay, I'll go with borderline and not depression. He said, Marcia, you are making the biggest mistake of your entire career. I'll never forget it. I said, well, I'm doing it anyway, so it turned out not to be a huge mistake. But that was obviously a problem. But once I did that, I had to have a model of the disorder. And there wasn't any model that a behaviorist could live with. Because, of course, I found out at that point that the only people who thought there was borderline personality disorder were psychoanalysts. And, of course, good behaviorists do not read psychoanalytic stuff. And when I read it, it didn't make a lot of sense because the theory was so completely divergent from any theory that I could deal with or what I think of as behavioral science. So but you do have to have a theory to do treatment. I had a theory of suicide, but now I need a theory of borderline. And I need one capable of, I have 3 criteria, only 3. Capable of guiding effective therapy, has to be non-pejorative and engendering compassion, has to be compatible with current research data. So my theory does all of that because when the data changes, I just change the theory. The basic model, which I fought all my career for this model, but I think I'm really winning the data, but I'm not going to give you data on it because it's not part of this talk, but I could, is borderline personality disorder is a pervasive regulation disorder, basically. And it's a pervasive disorder of emotion regulation system where you look at emotion as a system, not feelings, but a total system. That is a full person response, but it's an emotional response. And therefore it has action as part of it, thought and physiology, etc. And that borderline personality disorder criterion behaviors, if you actually look at them and really study them, function to regulate emotions. That's a number of them. Suicidal behavior, for example, is extraordinarily effective at regulating emotion. And the average person, I kid you not, actually believes that if they kill themselves, they will not feel as bad when they're dead. I point out to my clients there's no evidence of that particular point of view. Or suicidal behavior is a natural consequence of emotion dysregulation. You cannot have good relationships if you are not regulated. If you hate a person one day, love them the next, want to go to a movie with them one night, don't want to go the next, etc., etc. In other words, relationships, a sense of self, most of the criteria that are in there have to do with the fundamentals of emotion. So the solution was to develop a treatment of the pathogenesis. This, I have to say, it's a biological regulation disorder. I don't have the slightest doubt that there's a biological base to this disorder, and I don't believe you could create a borderline personality disorder without the biology. I could be wrong on that, but that's my experience in just watching all this time. Combined with what I call the invalidating social environment. Now, whether there are other characteristics of the environment besides invalidating covers a lot of territory, so far I haven't had to change the theory, but that's because I changed the definition of invalidation as needed. But my real point is, so we need more research on that. We're very, very, very limited on our research here. But it's much like the Patterson, like other research on the development of other disorders where this same, and that therefore the disorder is transactional. Transactional and dialectics are incompatible with blame, just to be clear. Because it is that the person A creates person B, but person B creates person A. So it's not like the family creates the disorder. It's the disorder creates the family, and the family creates the disorder, and the disorder, not the family, but the environment. And so you have this transactional over time creation of a disorder based on both characteristics, not necessarily the family, by the way. So what did I add to standard cognitive behavior therapy? I'm just going to go because I'm looking at the time and realize I'm supposed to be finished in a minute. So synthesis, acceptance, and change. Just remember I started way back. Most of the stuff's in there now, but it wasn't then. Principle-based integration of evidence-based treatments. I'm a big believer in bringing protocols into a principle-based approach as opposed to developing new therapies all the time. Focus on in-session behavior. Staging, targeting by severity and threat. DBT is organized in stages of treatment based on control. Suicide risk and assessment protocol. There's reason to believe now that this actually may be controlling a lot of our findings, much to my disbelief. Skills-based, evidence-based treatments. In other words, I stole all my skills from evidence-based treatments and mindfulness. Definition of team as part of therapy, and therapist self-disclosure. So what do the clinical trials say? There's really, no one disagrees right now that this treatment's effective. So that's not the fight at the moment. It was the fight for years, but it's no longer the fight. Everybody agrees the treatment works. The question now is why it works. We have 9 randomized trials on borderline personality disorder. DBT is going so far away from borderline now to other disorders that it's unclear that it's actually a treatment for borderline as it is a treatment for substantial dysregulation. For low-level, non-serious stuff, you would never need DBT. There are plenty of good treatments for that. DBT's real strength is when you have really serious dysregulation. DBT works then, or high risk, difficult to treat, multiple diagnoses, multiple stuff. That's when DBT sort of comes into its own. Otherwise, it becomes something else. Our data is it reduces suicide attempts, self-injury, depression, hopelessness, anger, substance dependence, impulsiveness. Now, the psychoanalytic people fought for years with me saying that only treated symptoms. Behaviorists, of course, don't even use the construct, but nonetheless. So I used one of the psychoanalytic measures and made them promise that they would stop saying that if I got the findings, and I did. So it also changes the introject, which is a psychoanalytic construct. This is just the suicidal behavior. This is suicidal behavior plus self-injury. The yellow is the people who didn't get DBT, and there have been a lot of internal validity controls in these studies. This is the percent attempting suicide. What I want to talk about for a moment is what matters. In other words, do you need the whole treatment? The standard treatment is individual DBT plus skills training plus phone calls to the individual therapist for coaching, behavioral coaching, plus a team. All the research I'm going to talk to you about now, every single one of them have a team and they have coaching of some sort, but not necessarily with the individual therapist. The first thing I want to, what happened was the slides didn't get put on here. I'm going to tell you our data. This is a fabulous study which NIMH funded. This is very important. What we did was we did a study looking at DBT, standard dialectical behavior therapy. Whoops, I better be over here. Standard dialectical behavior therapy, sort of the ordinary one, and we took highly suicidal people with a suicide attempt in the last year and self-injury or suicide attempt in the 8 weeks before they came in, and borderline personality. So most of them meet between 8 and 9 criteria. Okay, most of them aren't working, etc. So we did that. 1/3 of them went into standard behavior therapy. The same stuff that I tell everyone they have to do to say they're doing DBT. The other one went in to a treatment where we wanted to see is skills training important? Okay, so we gave one group the entire treatment except they didn't get skills training. We gave them a psychoeducation activities group like you get in community mental health. So that's group 2. We'll call that the individual therapy only group because they didn't get skills, the no skills group. And then we took another group and we wanted to say, is the individual DBT, the way it is run, is that important? Maybe we could get rid of that and just give people skills training. So we did, but because people were so highly suicidal, I thought I had to have somebody who could deal with crisis, so we gave them intensive case management, Washington State case management treatment manual. This is important to get that part. Washington State was manualized, and we had a supervisor, and they had a team. But they had skills training, intensive case management, but the intensive case managers only took calls during office hours. This is a big ticket item, but we gave a really good suicide crisis management plan to the crisis clinic in Seattle, which is one of those phone lines that every town has. Now, the other thing that happened in this study was I was very worried that I thought, I just can't let people die just because I want to do a study. So I gave the University of Washington, which is really DBT actually, risk assessment and management protocol, which is a treatment now designed to get people to want to treat suicidal people by giving you something that says, after a session, you check off whether you did it. And makes you verify, do you have risk and should you think of hospitalization? But the way it's set up is it tells you every reason not to hospitalize, which you can check off to say, I didn't do it, and I give you your reasons. I didn't do something else, and I give you your reasons. So the whole thing is sort of set up as to get therapists not to hospitalize and to do top-of-the-line risk management, mainly because I didn't think that was why the treatment was working. If I'd known what I know now, I might not have done this. So what happened? One, all the treatments were effective for reducing suicidal behavior, and they were equally effective, suggesting more than likely that the commonality across is what? Team and the risk management protocol, and some characteristics of having someone who could handle a crisis, okay, and sort of crisis management. And it was top of the line, I'm the first to admit. However, when you look at mental health outcomes, something different happened. This is one of my bigger life shocks, is what counts is the skills. Has a big effect on reducing depression, big effect on reducing anxiety, and the individual therapy is useless for that. Not useless, but not as good. Now, so in other words, since I was certain standard therapy would be the best, it never occurred to me to think anything else. But the only place that's good is it has half the dropout. So if you want to keep people in therapy, it's great. But why keep them in if you don't have to? If you can get them better without keeping them in? That's the way I look at this. So we're still analyzing the data. The outcome of this is two things. One, the skills probably are critical, and you've heard this from our colleagues over here who've said, "Teach me how to live," and that's exactly what it's designed for. They're designing it to go into 8th grade now. We've got the skills have all been translated down for 5 to 12-year-olds. There's kindergarten mindfulness training now. We run friends and family skills training. So I think that I underestimated this enormous value of the skills training. Now, the other thing that we do in DBT is we mostly taper them off psychotropic medication, and we keep them out of hospitals. And so it's possible that really the treatment that we have for suicidal behavior has been reducing hospitalization. There's not a single shred of evidence that any hospitalization ever kept anybody alive 5 extra minutes. But we all hospitalize, and all treatment as usual therapists are terrified not to hospitalize because they're afraid of being sued. So we have this unbelievable fear in our therapists. And when you can get therapists secure, which I obviously have been able to do, you can get that down. Now, I'm not saying standard might not be better in some ways. It's looking that during follow-up, maybe, it's coming back to life again. But the point I'm making to you is that without rigorous research that focuses on component analysis and tearing treatments apart, we're not going to get anywhere. And horse race therapy isn't going to help us. Managed care should do health insurance companies should do it, but science has to figure out how to improve and make treatments better. I have a lot here on training, but I'm going to skip it because I think my time's up and I don't want to go over. But we're now looking at skills training. It's being used. It treats treatment-resistant depression. We have studies on eating disorder or skills training. And so it's going widely across. And so we need to look at that, because even in our study with borderline drug addicts, what we found was that DBT was a little bit better on drugs, but it didn't. I don't know if it's worth the money on drugs, but it's really better on depression and anxiety. So let me tell you one thing, future, just one more last little thing. Here's where we're not good, just to be clear in case you thought we're good at everything. Standard DBT is really good at most disorders, except it's terrible at anxiety disorders, unless you target anxiety disorders specifically. And DBT does that, but only after you get suicidal behavior down. So we're now at our lab, Melanie Harnett, a research scientist working with me, and Martin Bohus in the Mannheim Institute of Psychiatry in Germany, head of that. We're collaborating and working on bringing prolonged exposure into DBT And the data we have so far suggests that this is going to, then we can move way up and deal with the anxiety disorders. So that says also that we've got to have these principle-based treatments and then the research on how to bring a module in for this, that, and the other. So thank you very much. Thank you. You all